In the precinct, you don't just witness an execution. You actively shove a screaming, begging man down the tracks, delivering him inch by inch into the high-voltage electrocution that will cook him alive. There is an orphanage where you don't just watch a ritual, you personally operate a buzzsaw to sever the legs of a crucified man, showering a congregation of child mannequins in his hot blood. There's a drug lab where murder is made into a production line, and a deformed gangster patrols it like a spoiled baby with a shotgun, forcing you to manufacture poison while he hunts you down. None of this is random violence. None of this is accidental cruelty. Every scream, every mutilation, every moment of terror serves a calculated purpose in one of the most methodically dark games ever created. The Outlast Trials takes place in the Cold War era, in a facility buried beneath the Arizona desert where ordinary people are kidnapped and systematically destroyed through programs designed to look like training but function as weaponized trauma. Picture the Saw films, but crank that to 10 and have it be an entire system designed to torture, traumatize, and corrupt people for study. This game builds its horror on historical atrocities that actually happened, on psychological techniques that were really used, on the uncomfortable truth that institutional evil doesn't need monsters. It just needs people willing to follow orders. Over the next hours, we're going to examine why the Outlast Trials is so relentlessly dark, what specific themes make it disturbing in ways other horror games never achieve, how it compares to the genre's other heavy hitters, and why Darkness This Bleak has found a massive audience hungry for exactly this kind of nightmare. By the end, you'll understand how the game weaponizes helplessness, why historical horror hits harder than the supernatural, and what it reveals about why we're drawn to experiences designed to make us feel powerless and afraid. If something in this deep dive resonates with you, drop a comment letting me know what detail stuck with you, whether it was a specific mechanic, a thematic element, or just a moment that hit differently than you expected. You can also suggest topics for future videos. Building this community means talking to each other in the comments, and that's genuinely my favorite part of all this. So get comfortable, dim the lights, and let's start. Chapter 1. The Foundation Built on Real Atrocity. The Outlast Trials begins with a lie. You're told you volunteered. You're informed you'll be helping your country. You're assured this is training that will make you stronger, more capable, ready for important work. The facility processes you like livestock, bolts night vision goggles directly onto your skull, strips away your name, and replaces it with a designation: reagent, a chemical component in someone else's experiment. Then trials begin, and you realize the lie was never meant to be convincing. It was meant to give you something to cling to while everything else was taken away. What makes the Outlast Trials darker than most horror games is that it didn't need to invent its premise. The Senyala facility, the programs designed to break and reprogram human consciousness, the systematic use of torture disguised as research. All of this builds directly on Project MKUltra, the Central Intelligence Agency's real program, and turned American citizens into unwitting test subjects for mind control experiments. MKUltra was vast. Over 80 institutions participated, including universities, hospitals, prisons, and pharmaceutical companies. The CIA operated through front organizations, hiding behind legitimate academic credentials so that respectable doctors could conduct experiments that violated every ethical standard medicine had developed. They dosed civilians with LSD without consent or knowledge. They explored sensory deprivation, electroshock therapy, surgical intervention on the brain. They wanted to know if you could erase someone's identity and reprogram them from scratch, turning human consciousness into something that could be wiped clean and rebuilt according to specifications. The most infamous location was the Allen Memorial Institute in Montreal, where Dr. Donald Ewan Cameron ran the sleep room. Patients arrived seeking treatment for depression or anxiety. What they received was induced coma lasting weeks, while speakers hidden under their pillows played recorded messages on endless loops. Cameron believed damaged minds could be erased and rebuilt. His patients left unable to recognize their own families, their memories destroyed, their sense of self so thoroughly shattered that rebuilding coherent identity became impossible. This was the treatment working exactly as designed. The Outlast Trials takes this documented history and extends it forward, asking what happened when MKUltra officially ended. The answer the game provides is simple and terrifying. The experiments didn't stop, they went private. Murkoff Corporation inherited the techniques, refined the methods, and built facilities where oversight didn't exist and consequences couldn't reach. This historical grounding creates darkness that supernatural horror can't match. When you're running through Signala's programs, fleeing from prime assets while completing objectives that force moral compromise, you're experiencing a horror that actually happened to real people. The techniques used to break reagents were really developed. The psychological principles that make the trials effective were really researched. The institutional structures that allowed atrocity to continue for decades really existed and may still exist in forms we haven't uncovered yet. The game never lets you forget this foundation. Documents scattered throughout the facility reference real MKUltra subprograms. The sleep room broadcasts echo Cameron's actual techniques. The pharmaceutical compounds administered to reagents build on drugs that were really tested on unwitting subjects. Every horror the game presents has roots in documented reality, and that reality is darker than any fiction could comfortably invent. This creates a specific kind of dread. Supernatural threats can be dismissed when the game ends. Ghosts and demons and monsters exist in fictional space, safely contained by the knowledge that none of it is real. But institutional horror, systematic cruelty authorized by governments and corporations, torture disguised as research and protected by classifications and legal immunity that exists in the real world. It happened before. It could happen again. It might be happening right now in facilities we'll only learn about when documents are declassified decades after the damage is done. The Outlast Trials forces you to sit with that possibility. Every trial becomes a reminder that human beings created these methods, that ordinary people implemented them, that victims suffered through them while the world outside continued normally, unaware or uncaring about the atrocities hidden just beneath the surface of civilized society. This is the first layer of the game's darkness. The horror is real, the techniques were used, the suffering actually happened, and the game refuses to let you look away or pretend any of it is safely fictional. But historical accuracy alone doesn't explain why the game feels so relentlessly oppressive. That requires understanding how the Outlast Trials weaponizes helplessness in ways that other horror games rarely attempt and almost never sustain for such extended periods. Chapter 2: Helplessness as the core mechanic. Most horror games give you tools. Weapons with limited ammunition. Safe rooms where monsters can't follow. Mechanics that let you fight back even if fighting is difficult or costly. This creates a specific emotional arc. Fear rises during encounters, then releases when you overcome threats or reach safety. The cycle of tension and relief keeps the experience engaging without becoming unbearable. The Outlast Trials removes almost all of that structure. You have no weapons. You cannot fight the prime assets who hunt you through the trials. Your only defensive options are running, hiding, and hoping you can break line of sight long enough for them to search elsewhere. You are fundamentally, mechanically, deliberately powerless against the primary threats the game throws at you. This design choice creates unrelenting psychological pressure. In most horror games, the question is whether you can defeat or escape the current threat. In Outlast Trials, the question is whether you can complete objectives While being hunted by enemies, you cannot meaningfully resist. Every task becomes exponentially harder because accomplishing anything requires exposing yourself to dangers you can only delay, never eliminate. Consider the structure of a typical trial. You're given objectives that force you to move through environments designed to favor your hunters. Retrieve items, activate machinery, perform tasks that require standing still while progress bars fill, leaving you vulnerable for extended periods. Meanwhile, prime assets patrol the area with better knowledge of the terrain, enhanced abilities that let them track you through methods normal stealth can't counter, and the capacity to down you in seconds if they catch you. The experience becomes a constant negotiation between progress and survival. You need to complete objectives to finish the trial, but attempting objectives dramatically increases your chances of detection. You need to move forward, but moving forward means entering areas you haven't scouted, where enemies might already be waiting or where the environment itself might trigger alerts that bring hunters directly to your position. This creates a specific form of stress that other horror games rarely sustain. You're never safe. There are no true safe rooms, no guaranteed pauses, no moments where you can fully relax and recover. Even the sleep room between trials becomes a space of psychological manipulation, where Easterman's broadcasts continue conditioning you while you're told you're resting. The helplessness extends beyond mechanics into the game's thematic structure. You're not a hero who stumbled into horror. You're a victim who was deliberately targeted, kidnapped, and processed into an experiment where your consent was never requested, and your resistance is structurally irrelevant. The facility was designed to break people like you. Every system exists to ensure you have no meaningful agency beyond choosing which trauma to experience next. This distinguishes the Outlast Trials from most survival horror. Games like Resident Evil or Dead Space put you in dangerous situations, but you're still positioned as someone fighting against those dangers, someone whose skills and resources can overcome threats through competence and persistence. The power fantasy remains intact even when ammunition is scarce, and enemies are overwhelming. You're still the protagonist, still someone whose actions matter in ways that can change outcomes. Outlast Trials strips that framework away. You're not the protagonist, you're the subject, the experiment, the raw material being processed through someone else's machinery toward purposes you don't fully understand and can't meaningfully resist. This helplessness becomes existential when you realize that completing trials successfully doesn't mean escaping or defeating the system. It means proving you're exactly what the system wants to create. Every successful trial demonstrates that you can be made to compromise morally, to prioritize survival over principle, to function within parameters designed to destroy your sense of self. Winning means becoming the weapon Murkoff intended to forge. The game reinforces this through its progression system. You gain access to better equipment and abilities by completing trials, by earning currency the facility provides, by succeeding according to metrics the experiment established. You become more effective at surviving the trials through mechanics that require you to more thoroughly internalize the logic of the facility itself. This creates a trap that extends beyond the game into how you think about playing it. To progress, you must optimize. You must learn patrol patterns, memorize layouts, develop strategies that minimize risk and maximize objective completion. You must, in other words, think like someone who's accepted the trials as a legitimate challenge to be mastered rather than an atrocity to be resisted. The game knows this. It builds the trap deliberately. By the time you've invested hours into learning the systems, improving your character, and developing skills that make you better at completing trials, you've already accepted the premise that escaping would require rejecting. You've become complicit in your own conditioning through the simple act of engaging with the game's mechanical structures. This creates darkness that operates on multiple levels simultaneously. The surface level is the violence, the body horror, the immediate threats chasing you through darkened corridors. The deeper level is the realization that your powerlessness isn't a temporary state to overcome through gameplay. It's the permanent condition the entire system was designed to create and reinforce until accepting it feels more rational than resisting it. But helplessness alone doesn't fully explain the game's oppressive atmosphere. That requires examining the specific nature of the threats you face and what they represent about human capacity for cruelty when institutional authority removes consequences. Chapter 3: The Prime Assets as Reflections of Institutional Evil. The enemies in the Outlast Trials aren't monsters. They're people. Damaged, broken, psychologically destroyed. People who were either recruited specifically because their existing pathologies made them useful, or who were created through the same processes the game forces on you. Supernatural threats allow emotional distance. When a demon or ghost or unknowable entity tries to kill you, the horror exists in a category separate from human experience. These things operate according to alien logic, motivated by hungers or purposes that don't map onto human psychology. They're frightening, but the fear remains contained within fictional frameworks. The prime assets remove that distance. Leland Coyle is a former police officer who used his badge as permission for sadism. Mother Gooseberry is a woman whose childhood abuse fractured her mind into personas that express love through violence. Franco Barbie is a mob enforcer who learned as a child that murder was the only language that earned approval. Each prime asset is someone who existed in the real world before Murkoff found them, someone whose damage made them perfect for institutional roles where cruelty could be reframed as necessary work. This grounds the horror in uncomfortable reality. The prime assets aren't completely unbelievable monsters. They're what happens when people with specific psychological profiles are given a system of authority and told their worst impulses serve legitimate purposes. They're cops who've always wanted to torture suspects without consequences. They're caregivers whose protective instincts twisted into controlling violence. They're enforcers who discovered that killing feels like the only thing they're good at. Murkoff didn't create these people. The corporation just found them and provided environments where their existing pathologies could be used and studied without the limit of normal society. This reveals something deeply disturbing about institutional evil. It doesn't require recruiting monsters. It just requires identifying people whose damage aligns with organizational needs and then removing the social constraints that previously limited how that damage could be expressed. Give someone permission, authority, and immunity from consequences, and you'll discover exactly what they would have always done if they'd believed they could get away with it. The game demonstrates this through how the prime assets operate within their programs. Coyle doesn't torture because he's being forced or because he believes he's serving some greater good. He tortures because he enjoys it, because the police station environment lets him act out everything he wants to do without having to hide it behind the mask of being a good cop. This creates horror that feels more realistic and therefore more threatening than supernatural alternatives. The prime assets are what ordinary people become when systems reward their worst traits and punish their resistance to committing atrocity. They're proof that human beings don't need to be fundamentally evil to do evil things. They just need institutional permission and enough psychological damage or moral flexibility to accept that permission when it's offered. The game extends this theme through the X-Pops, the failed reagents who've been driven insane but remain useful as obstacles and environmental threats. These aren't people who were recruited for their capacity for violence. They're people who went through the same trials you're experiencing, who broke in ways that made them useless for Murkoff's purposes but entertaining enough to keep around as living hazards. The X-Pops represent your potential future. Not the worst-case scenario where you die during trials, but the outcome where you survive with your mind so thoroughly destroyed that you can't function as anything except a broken remnant. They're what happens when the conditioning fails to create a useful weapon, and instead produces something that can only shamble through hallways and attack anything that moves. This positions every trial as a negotiation between outcomes that are all terrible. Die during the trial, break completely and become an ex-pop. Survive successfully and prove you're exactly what Murkoff wanted to create. There's no good option, no path that leads to genuine escape or preservation of self. Every choice simply determines which form your destruction will take. The prime assets embody this institutional evil at its most concentrated. They're not forcing you through trials because they're evil people who enjoy suffering. They're forcing you through trials because the institution defined their roles, provided their authority, and assured them that everything they're doing serves necessary purposes. The fact that some of them do enjoy the suffering is almost secondary to the structural permission they've been granted to indulge that enjoyment without consequence. This creates a horror that persists beyond individual encounters. Every time you flee from Coil, or hide from Gooseberry, or avoid Barbie, you're experiencing a microcosm of how institutional evil functions in the real world. People with power and no accountability doing terrible things to people without power or recourse, while the institution that enabled everything remains safely distant from the violence it authorized and continues profiting from the suffering it created. The prime assets are frightening because they're realistic, because people like them exist in actual institutions, because the only thing separating Coil from certain real police officers, or Gooseberry from certain real caregivers, or Barbie from certain real enforcers, is that those real people haven't yet been given institutional permission to drop the pretense of serving anyone except themselves. The game knows this. It builds the prime assets as mirrors reflecting what humans become when the structures meant to constrain us instead encourage our worst impulses and call them virtuous. That explains why the enemies feel so oppressive. But it doesn't explain why the objectives themselves create such profound moral discomfort, why the game forces you to do things that feel worse than simply surviving encounters with dangerous enemies. That requires examining how the trials weaponize complicity. Chapter 4: Forced Complicity and the Erosion of Moral Certainty. Horror games typically position violence as defensive. You kill monsters because they're trying to kill you. You destroy threats because they're threatening innocent people. The violence might be graphic, but it's morally uncomplicated. You're defending yourself or others against clear dangers that leave you no reasonable alternative. The Outlast Trials deliberately corrupts this framework. The trials don't just ask you to survive. They force you to participate in atrocities that have nothing to do with self-defense or protection. They make you complicit in suffering you could theoretically refuse to cause, then punish that refusal so severely that resistance becomes structurally unsustainable. Consider the first major trial most players encounter. Kill the Snitch places you in a police station where your objective is identifying another reagent designated as a snitch and delivering them for punishment. The mechanics are straightforward. Locate the marked individual, grab them, drag them to an electrocution chamber while they struggle and beg. Activate the device and watch them die. The target has done nothing to you. They're another victim of the same system, another person who was kidnapped and processed and thrown into trials designed to break them. Killing them serves no defensive purpose. It doesn't protect you or others. It simply demonstrates your willingness to murder on command when the institution provides objectives and consequences. The game structures this choice carefully. You can refuse. You can stand in the police station and decline to participate in executing another human being for the crime of being randomly designated as requiring execution. But refusal carries immediate consequences. Coil becomes actively hostile instead of merely patrolling. Ex-pops spawn in increasing numbers. The environment itself turns aggressive, making it progressively impossible to survive unless you complete the objective and move forward. This creates a form of coercion that operates through mechanical pressure rather than direct force. Nobody holds a gun to your head. Nobody explicitly threatens you if you don't comply. The system simply makes non-compliance so costly that compliance becomes the only practical option, then records your compliance as evidence of voluntary participation. This mirrors how institutional evil functions in reality. Organizations rarely force people to commit atrocities through explicit threats. Instead, they create environments where refusing to commit atrocities costs more than committing them, where moral resistance leads to professional destruction or social isolation or material consequences that feel unbearable compared to the abstract harm you're being asked to inflict on people you don't know and will never have to face afterward. The genius and the horror of this design is how it implicates the player in systems they would likely oppose outside the game. You probably wouldn't support executing random people on police command. You probably wouldn't participate in torture disguised as judicial process. You probably wouldn't wheel human beings to their deaths in some facility's basement. But the game creates conditions where you do exactly that, and it makes you do it not once, in some dramatic moral crisis, but repeatedly, until performing atrocities becomes routine, until you stop thinking about the ethical dimensions and start optimizing for completion speed, until the suffering you're causing becomes background noise against the mechanical challenge of finishing objectives efficiently. This gradual normalization is where the real darkness lives. The game doesn't break you through one horrible choice. It breaks you through 100 smaller choices, each one individually justifiable in context, collectively adding up to the complete erosion of whatever moral lines you thought you'd never cross. The trial called Cleanse the Orphans demonstrates this through even more disturbing content. You're placed in an orphanage setting where objectives require you to complete tasks that look like protecting children but feel like participating in ritualistic abuse. Objectives require performing tasks that deliberately invoke disturbing religious imagery. Another requires performing actions that deliberately echo religious imagery corrupted into blasphemy. The trial never asks you to directly harm children. The mannequins might not even be human, might just be plastic props meant to create atmosphere. But the imagery remains, and your participation in that imagery creates associations that feel profoundly wrong, even when you can rationalize that nothing real is being harmed. This is deliberate psychological manipulation. The trial isn't trying to make you believe you're hurting children. It's trying to make you participate in scenarios that invoke that imagery, creating cognitive dissonance. The dissonance becomes corrosive. You know intellectually that nothing real is being harmed, but the emotional weight of participating in these scenarios persists anyway. Your brain registers the imagery, processes the symbols, and creates associations that don't disappear just because you can logically explain that the game is fictional and the suffering isn't real. This creates darkness that extends beyond the game into how you feel about having played it. Other horror games let you leave their violence behind when you stop playing. The zombies you shot stay safely contained in fictional space. The monsters you defeated remain in the game world where they belong. But the complicity the Outlast Trials creates feels harder to compartmentalize. You didn't just survive horror. You participated in it. You performed actions the game explicitly framed as morally reprehensible. You became complicit in suffering even though that suffering was fictional, and the fact that it was fictional doesn't completely erase the emotional reality of having made choices you would condemn in any other context. This positions the game as actively hostile to player comfort. Most horror games want you scared but ultimately entertained, challenged but not genuinely disturbed. They provide experiences that trigger adrenaline and fear responses but remain safely contained within entertainment frameworks. The Outlast Trials seems designed to make you uncomfortable with your own participation, to create situations where the only way to progress requires accepting moral compromise you'd typically refuse, to demonstrate how easy it is to become complicit in systems you oppose when non-compliance carries costs you're unwilling to pay. This explains why the game feels so relentlessly dark compared to other horror titles. It's not just showing you terrible things, it's making you do terrible things, then forcing you to live with the knowledge that you did them. Even if you can rationalize that context made them necessary, or that fictional victims don't create real harm, the question becomes whether that discomfort serves any purpose beyond shock value, whether the game's darkness reveals something meaningful about institutional evil and human capacity for compromise, or whether it's just cruelty disguised as commentary. That tension remains unresolved, and different players will answer it differently depending on what they believe horror, as a genre, should be allowed to do, and what lines it shouldn't cross even in pursuit of thematic coherence. But that ambiguity itself might be the point. The game refuses to let you feel entirely comfortable with your participation or entirely justified in your resistance. It exists in spaces where neither complete complicity nor complete refusal feels sustainable, and it forces you to navigate that impossibility over and over until the exhaustion becomes part of the experience. That explains why objectives feel so morally corroded. But it doesn't explain why the atmosphere itself feels so oppressive, why the game maintains its psychological weight even during moments when you're not actively being chased or forced into moral compromise. That requires examining how the Outlast Trials constructs dread through environmental design and systematic uncertainty. Chapter 5. The Architecture of Dread and Systematic Uncertainty. The Signala facility feels wrong before anything overtly terrible happens. The architecture creates discomfort through subtle wrongness that registers subconsciously before you can articulate what bothers you. Corridors branch at angles that don't quite make geometric sense. Rooms that should be identical have variations too small to consciously notice, but significant enough to prevent your brain from building reliable spatial maps. Lighting shifts unpredictably, sometimes bright enough to see clearly, other times dim enough that shadows could hide threats, or nothing at all. This environmental design creates constant low-level anxiety that compounds during encounters. You can never fully relax because the space itself resists becoming familiar. Other games let you learn layouts, memorize routes, develop comfort through repetition. Signala's architecture actively fights that process. The facility feels different every time you move through it, even when the actual geometry hasn't changed, because your brain can't establish the neural patterns that would make navigation automatic and comfortable. Sound design amplifies this uncertainty. The facility is never silent. Distant machinery hums and clanks. Pipes rattle. Footsteps echo from indeterminate directions. Screams bleed through walls, close enough to be disturbing but too muffled to determine whether they're genuine distress, recordings meant to unsettle you, or sounds from other trials happening simultaneously in adjacent spaces. The ambiguity becomes weaponized. You hear footsteps and freeze, trying to determine if they're a prime asset approaching or another reagent moving through nearby areas, or just ambient sound designed to trigger paranoia. The game provides no reliable way to distinguish between actual threats and atmospheric noise. Every sound could be danger, every sound could be nothing. The only way to know is risking exposure by investigating or continuing forward and hoping you didn't ignore something that's now tracking you. This creates decision paralysis during moments that should be straightforward. Do you investigate that noise or keep moving toward your objective? Do you hide preemptively when you hear something ambiguous, wasting time that might let other players complete objectives before you? Or do you keep going and risk walking directly into a prime asset's patrol path? The game rewards paranoia and punishes it in equal measure. Players who hide at every sound spend excessive time in trials, increasing the likelihood that they'll be discovered through sheer duration. Players who ignore suspicious sounds and push forward sometimes walk directly into threats they could have avoided if they'd been more cautious. There's no correct approach, no strategy that eliminates risk, only different gambles with different potential consequences. The facility's visual design reinforces this through environmental storytelling that suggests atrocities without showing them directly. Bloodstains on walls, scratches that look like fingernails dragged across concrete, medical equipment left in hallways, still stained from whatever procedures they were used for. Empty wheelchairs positioned in ways that suggest their former occupants didn't leave them voluntarily. These environmental details create dread through implication. The game doesn't need to show you the torture happening in adjacent rooms. It just needs to provide enough evidence that your imagination fills in the gaps, creating horrors more specific to your personal fears than any scripted scene could achieve. This technique distinguishes psychological horror from shock horror. Games that rely on jump scares and graphic violence create immediate fear responses that dissipate quickly once the shocking moment passes. Environmental horror creates persistent unease that builds cumulatively, where each detail adds to an accumulating weight that never fully releases. The Outlast Trials combines both approaches, layering immediate threats on top of environmental dread. You're being chased by prime assets who can kill you, which creates acute fear during encounters. But even when you're safe from immediate threats, the environment maintains psychological pressure through all the elements suggesting that safety is temporary and illusory. The sleep room demonstrates this combination perfectly. The space is presented as a rest area between trials, somewhere you can recover and prepare for the next challenge. But the room itself is psychologically hostile in subtle ways. The beds are comfortable enough to make you want to stay, but not comfortable enough to let you forget where you are. The lighting is soft, but never quite dark enough for genuine sleep, and Easterman's voice continues broadcasting throughout, maintaining the flow of manipulation even during moments the game pretends are respite. The broadcasts themselves are masterfully crafted psychological warfare. Easterman never sounds overtly threatening. He presents as a concerned father figure, someone who believes in your potential and wants you to succeed. He praises your progress through trials. He acknowledges that the process is difficult, but insists it's necessary and worthwhile. He frames everything through language of improvement and enhancement rather than destruction and control. This creates cognitive dissonance between what you're experiencing and how it's being described to you. You've just participated in executing another human being. You've just performed rituals in an orphanage setting that felt like trauma theater. You've just spent extended time being hunted by people who clearly want to hurt you. But Easterman's voice tells you these were training exercises, opportunities for growth, evidence of your increasing capability. The gap between experience and explanation becomes crazy-making. The game knows you know the trials are torture, but it continues insisting they're not, continues framing atrocity as advancement, continues speaking to you as though you're a willing participant in self-improvement rather than a victim being systematically destroyed. This mirrors techniques used in actual coercive control situations. Abusers rarely present their abuse as abuse. They frame it as necessary correction, as actions taken for your benefit, as evidence of how much they care about making you better. The contradiction between their words and their actions creates a specific form of psychological damage where victims begin doubting their own perceptions and accepting the abuser's framing because maintaining resistance requires constant mental energy that eventually becomes unsustainable. The Outlast Trials replicates this dynamic through Easterman's broadcasts. The voice is always there, always reframing, always insisting that your interpretation of events is wrong. and his explanation is correct. After enough exposure, after enough trials, where his voice provides the only consistent narrative thread connecting your experiences, accepting his framing starts to feel easier than maintaining resistance. This creates darkness that operates through psychological manipulation rather than overt horror. The facility isn't just trying to scare you, it's trying to reprogram how you think about what's happening to you, to erode your capacity to trust your own judgment, to make you dependent on external validation, even when that validation comes from the system actively destroying you. The game extends this through its progression systems. You earn currency by completing trials successfully. You spend that currency on equipment and upgrades that make subsequent trials more manageable. The entire economy reinforces the idea that participating in the system yields rewards, that compliance leads to improvement, that the path of least suffering runs directly through accepting your role as a reagent and optimizing your performance within that role. This creates a trap where playing the game well requires internalizing exactly the logic the game is critiquing. To progress, you must treat trials as challenges to overcome rather than atrocities to resist. You must optimize your builds and strategies. You must learn to work within the system efficiently. And the more effectively you do this, the more you're demonstrating that the conditioning is working exactly as designed. The question becomes whether the game can critique these systems while also being an example of them, whether making players experience manipulation can create genuine insight, or whether it just replicates the harm it's attempting to examine. Different players will experience this differently depending on how much distance they can maintain between their mechanical engagement with the game and their emotional response to what that engagement represents. But the ambiguity itself reveals something about how institutional evil functions. The systems don't announce themselves as evil. They present as necessary, as offering genuine benefits in exchange for compliance, as providing paths to improvement that just happen to require moral compromise along the way. By the time you realize what you've been participating in, you've already invested too much to walk away without facing everything you accepted to get this far. That explains how the environment creates oppression beyond immediate threats. But it doesn't explain why this particular form of darkness has found such a substantial audience, why players seek out experiences designed to make them feel powerless and complicit. That requires examining what the Outlast Trials offers that other horror games don't provide. Chapter 6: Why Darkness? This deep attracts an audience. Horror as a genre exists in tension between repulsion and fascination. We claim to hate being scared, yet we seek out experiences designed to terrify us. We say we want to feel safe, yet we pay money to feel endangered in controlled environments. This paradox intensifies with games like the Outlast Trials that push beyond conventional horror into territory that feels genuinely oppressive rather than entertainingly frightening. The question becomes what psychological needs this extreme darkness satisfies, what audiences gain from experiences that most people would find unbearable. One answer involves control through simulation. The real world contains threats you cannot predict or prepare for. Institutional evil operates in spaces you can't see and couldn't resist if you could. Trauma happens without warning to people who did nothing to deserve it. This fundamental lack of control over whether terrible things happen creates baseline anxiety that modern life does little to address. Horror games offer a strange solution. They let you experience terrible things in environments where you control exposure. You choose when to play. You choose when to stop. The threats are real within the game's fiction, but can't follow you into actual life. This creates a space where you can confront fears that would be overwhelming in reality, building tolerance and familiarity with emotions that otherwise remain abstract and unprocessed. The Outlast Trials takes this further by focusing specifically on institutional powerlessness. Many people carry experiences of being subjected to systems that didn't care about their consent or well-being, medical procedures that felt violating, educational or workplace environments that demanded compliance regardless of personal cost, legal or governmental systems that treated them as problems to be managed, rather than people deserving dignity. These experiences create wounds that don't have clear outlets for processing. The game provides a fictional space where those dynamics can be explored and survived. You experience systematic dehumanization, mechanical processing by uncaring institutions, forced participation in systems designed to break you. But you experience all of this in an environment where survival is possible, where resistance has meaning even if it's mechanically limited, where the horror eventually ends when you stop playing. This creates a form of exposure therapy for traumas that don't have conventional treatment frameworks. The game lets you sit with feelings of powerlessness and violation in doses you can control, potentially building resilience or at least familiarity with emotions that real institutional abuse created, but left unprocessed. Another answer involves validation through representation. People who've experienced institutional abuse or systematic dehumanization often struggle to convey what that experience felt like to people who haven't lived through it. The mechanics of coercive control, the way systems create impossible choices, and then record your decisions as voluntary, the psychological erosion that happens when every option leads to harm, these dynamics are difficult to explain through conventional language. The Outlast Trials represents these experiences through interactive mechanics. It shows rather than tells what institutional evil feels like from the inside. Players who've lived through similar dynamics see their experiences reflected in the game's systems. Players who haven't lived through them gain insight that pure description couldn't provide. This validation matters more than it might initially seem. Trauma survivors often face dismissal or minimization when trying to explain what they experienced. People question why they didn't just leave, why they complied with harmful demands, why they didn't resist more effectively. These questions come from people who haven't experienced how coercive systems destroy the capacity to resist, how gradual escalation makes each individual compromise feel smaller than the cost of refusing. The game demonstrates these dynamics mechanically. It shows why leaving isn't simple when the system controls your resources and options. It shows why compliance happens when refusal carries consequences you're not equipped to handle. It shows why resistance fails when the institution designed every element to prevent exactly that resistance. Players who've experienced institutional abuse see their reality represented accurately, perhaps for the first time. Players who haven't gain understanding that might make them less likely to blame victims for not escaping situations that were designed to be inescapable. A third answer involves the appeal of worst-case scenarios. Anxiety often focuses on vague possibilities that never resolve into concrete outcomes. What if I lose control? What if systems I trust betray me? What if I'm subjected to suffering I can't prevent or escape? These questions create ongoing psychological tension because they remain abstract and unresolved. Horror games provide concrete answers. The worst happens. You lose control. Systems do betray you. You are subjected to suffering you can't immediately prevent. But you also see what happens next. You discover that even worst-case scenarios have shapes and parameters, that horror has limits even when it feels unlimited, that survival remains possible even when circumstances seem designed to make survival impossible. The Outlast Trials excels at this because it doesn't shy away from truly dark outcomes. The game doesn't promise that everything will be okay, or that heroic effort guarantees escape. It shows you the worst institutional evil can achieve, then demonstrates that even under those conditions, agency persists in limited forms. You can't defeat the system, but you can navigate it. You can't escape entirely, but you can survive individual trials. You can't prevent all suffering, but you can choose how you respond to what can't be prevented. This provides a strange form of comfort. The game confirms that your worst fears about institutional power are valid, that systems really can destroy people systematically and call it necessary. But it also demonstrates that even within those systems, the self persists in forms that totalizing control can't completely eliminate. A fourth answer involves community through shared suffering. The Outlast Trials supports multiplayer, allowing groups to experience its horrors together. This creates bonds through collective trauma that single-player experiences can't replicate. You're not just surviving trials alone. You're coordinating with others, making collective decisions about who takes which risks, experiencing relief together when someone narrowly escapes a prime asset. This mirrors how real communities form around shared hardship. People who've survived similar traumas often feel more connected to others who've lived through comparable experiences than to people whose lives remained comfortable and safe. The shared understanding of what that suffering feels like creates intimacy that's difficult to achieve through positive experiences alone. The game facilitates this through mechanics that require cooperation. You can complete trials alone, but group attempts become more manageable when players coordinate roles and cover for each other's weaknesses. This creates practical incentives for cooperation that transform strangers into teammates through repeated exposure to stressful situations where mutual support determines outcomes. The community that forms around the game extends this dynamic. Players share strategies, discuss lore, compare experiences of particular trials or prime assets. They create content analyzing the game's themes, exploring its historical connections, examining its psychological accuracy. This shared engagement creates spaces where people process the game's darkness collectively rather than individually, making the experience more bearable through communal meaning-making. A fifth answer involves the appeal of horror that takes itself seriously. Many modern horror games incorporate humor or camp elements that provide emotional release from tension. This makes them more accessible and less potentially traumatic, but it also limits their capacity to explore genuinely dark themes. The ironic distance these games cultivate prevents them from fully committing to the horror they're presenting. The Outlast Trials rarely breaks its own reality. The game commits fully to its premise and maintains that commitment, even when that commitment creates discomfort. It doesn't wink at the camera or provide comic relief to lighten the mood. It presents institutional evil as terrible and unrelenting, then follows that presentation to its logical conclusions without flinching. This appeals to audiences tired of horror that pulls punches or that can't sustain its atmosphere because it's too concerned with remaining entertaining. The Outlast Trials prioritizes coherence over comfort. It asks what horror would look like if it took its theme seriously and didn't compromise darkness for accessibility. The result is a game that respects its audience enough to trust them with genuinely oppressive content. It doesn't assume players need protection from its implications, or that horror must ultimately reassure rather than disturb. It offers an experience that treats darkness as meaningful rather than merely atmospheric, as something that reveals truth about institutional power and human vulnerability rather than just providing scares. These answers collectively explain why the Outlast Trials has found its audience, despite, or perhaps because of, its relentless oppressiveness. The game offers things that lighter horror can't provide: validation for trauma survivors, insight for people trying to understand institutional evil, community through shared adversity, horror that commits to its premise without reservation. But this raises uncomfortable questions about what we're consuming when we engage with horror this dark, whether there are lines horror shouldn't cross even in pursuit of thematic coherence, whether experiencing systematic dehumanization as entertainment creates problematic distances from the real suffering those systems continue inflicting on actual people. That tension remains unresolved, and the game doesn't attempt to resolve it. The Outlast Trials exists in that uncomfortable space where entertainment and genuine disturbance overlap, where the same experience that provides catharsis for some players might trigger trauma responses in others, where meaningful art and potentially harmful content occupy the same mechanical and thematic space. This ambiguity might be the most honest thing about the game. It refuses to pretend that institutional horror can be made safe, or that experiencing systematic cruelty as gameplay is morally uncomplicated. It presents its darkness without apology, but also without claiming that darkness serves purely educational or therapeutic purposes. The game exists. You can engage with it or not. Your response will reveal something about what you need from horror and what you believe horror should be allowed to do. But the game won't make those decisions for you or promise that engagement will leave you unchanged. That explains why audiences seek this particular form of darkness, but it doesn't explain how the Outlast Trials compares to other horror games attempting similar themes, where it succeeds beyond its peers, and where other games might offer approaches this one doesn't attempt. That requires examining the broader horror landscape and positioning Outlast Trials within it. Chapter 7: How the Outlast Trials compares to other horror games. The horror game genre contains multiple approaches to creating fear and discomfort. Each approach prioritizes different elements and creates different emotional experiences. Understanding where the Outlast Trials fits requires examining what distinguishes it from other major entries in survival horror and psychological horror spaces. Silent Hill represents horror built on guilt and psychological breakdown. The town manifests nightmares specific to each character's trauma, creating environments where monsters and spaces reflect internal damage rather than external threats. The horror becomes deeply personal, intimately tied to who's experiencing it and what psychological wounds they carry. The Outlast Trials shares Silent Hill's interest in systematic psychological destruction, but approaches it from the opposite direction. Silent Hill asks what your mind would create if your trauma became environmental. Outlast Trials asks what institutional systems create when they deliberately engineer trauma. One is internal horror made external. The other is external horror designed to become internal. This creates different emotional textures. Silent Hill's horror feels inevitable and deserved, as though the town is giving characters exactly what their guilt demands. There's a strange justice to it, even when that justice is terrible. Outlast Trials horror feels arbitrary and imposed, suffering inflicted by systems that don't care about individual psychology beyond how it can be exploited. There's no cosmic justice, just institutional machinery processing human beings toward predetermined outcomes. Resident Evil built the survival horror template around resource management and defensive violence. You have weapons, but limited ammunition. You can fight, but every fight depletes resources you'll need for future encounters. The horror comes from scarcity, from making every bullet count because you don't have enough to waste. The Outlast Trials removes the violence option entirely. Where Resident Evil creates tension through asking whether you can afford to fight, Outlast Trials creates tension by removing fighting as an option at all. This positions it as survival horror's more extreme evolution, horror that asks what happens when you strip away even limited defensive capability. The comparison reveals what each approach gains and loses. Resident Evil's combat creates agency. You can reduce threats through skill and resource management. This makes the game feel empowering even during difficult moments, because competence directly impacts outcomes. Outlast Trials' complete powerlessness creates oppression that never releases. There's no moment where you turn the tables or feel powerful. The best outcome is escaping situations that will recur in the next trial. This makes Outlast Trials harder to play for extended periods. Resident Evil. provides enough power fantasy to balance its horror. You're frightened, but also capable. Endangered, but also equipped. Outlast Trials maintains helplessness throughout, creating psychological weight that compounds over time without the release that combat mechanics provide. Amnesia pioneered the hiding-focused horror that Outlast Trials inherits. The Dark Descent removed combat entirely, forcing players to hide from monsters they couldn't fight, creating terror through vulnerability rather than resource management. The sanity mechanic added psychological costs to even witnessing threats, mechanically representing mental breakdown through gameplay systems. The Outlast Trials builds on Amnesia's foundation but adds institutional framing that changes the horror's nature. Amnesia's threats are supernatural, ancient, operating according to logic that predates human civilization. Fearing them feels appropriate because they're genuinely alien and unknowable. Outlast Trials threats are human, recent, operating according to institutional protocols developed in the 20th century. Fearing them feels different because they're not alien at all. They're exactly what humans create when systems remove accountability. This creates horror that's more politically charged than Amnesia's cosmic dread. Amnesia suggests the universe contains forces that want to drive you insane. Outlast Trials suggests human institutions want to drive you insane and have developed effective methods for doing so. One horror exists beyond human control. The other is human creation through and through. Dead Space represents horror built on isolation and body horror. You're alone on a mining ship where former crew members have been transformed into grotesque monsters. The game emphasizes visceral gore, dismemberment mechanics, and the fundamental vulnerability of human bodies to forces that want to tear them apart. The Outlast Trials shares Dead Space's interest in bodily violation but focuses on psychological rather than physical dismemberment. Where Dead Space shows bodies transformed into nightmares, Outlast Trials shows minds transformed into weapons. The body horror in Outlast Trials comes from procedures that alter you without permission, from goggles bolted to your skull, from the physical reality of being processed like livestock through institutional machinery. Both games understand that horror intensifies when it targets what makes you human. Dead Space attacks physical integrity. Outlast Trials attacks psychological autonomy. Both create visceral fear responses, but the flavor differs. Dead Space's horror ends when you stop the immediate threat. Outlast Trials horror persists because the damage is psychological, carried forward even after physical dangers pass. Alien isolation created horror through perfect predation. The xenomorph learns from your tactics, adapts to your hiding spots, creates constant threat that you can evade temporarily but never eliminate. The game becomes an extended cat and mouse experience where you're always the mouse and the cat is always learning. The Outlast Trials prime assets function similarly, learning patrol patterns and adapting to player behavior. But the key difference is multiplicity. Alien isolation focuses terror on a single perfect threat. Outlast Trials distributes threat across multiple prime assets, each with different hunting styles, each creating different types of encounters. This creates different psychological experiences. Alien isolation's singular focus makes the xenomorph feel like a force of nature, an apex predator that fills every space with potential danger. Outlast Trials' multiple threats feel more like systematic persecution, institutional deployment of various methodologies to ensure that no matter your particular vulnerabilities, the facility has something designed to exploit them. Soma explored horror built on questions of identity and consciousness. The game asked what it means to be yourself when your mind can be copied, when continuity of consciousness might be illusion, when the self might be less singular and permanent than we assume. The horror came from philosophical questions made visceral through gameplay. The Outlast Trials approaches similar territory through different methods. Where Soma questioned what the self is, Outlast Trials questions what happens when the self is deliberately destroyed and rebuilt according to external specifications. Both games create existential horror, but Soma's is metaphysical while Outlast Trials is institutional. One asks deep questions about consciousness. The other demonstrates what happens when organizations don't care about the answers and just start reprogramming people anyway. This comparison reveals the Outlast Trials' unique position in horror gaming. It combines Amnesia's helplessness with Soma's interest in destroyed identity, adds Dead Space's visceral body horror, and Alien Isolation's perfect predation, then frames everything through institutional evil that gives the horror political dimensions most survival horror avoids. The result is a game that feels unusually oppressive even by horror standards, where other games provide at least some power or agency or moments of triumph. Outlast Trials maintains systematic helplessness while forcing complicity in atrocity. Where other games keep horror safely supernatural or cosmic, Outlast Trials grounds everything in historical reality that makes the horror feel possible rather than fantastical. This positioning explains why the game has found dedicated audiences while also remaining niche compared to more accessible horror titles. It offers something horror fans can't get elsewhere: genuine institutional oppression represented through mechanics rather than narrative, darkness that doesn't compromise or provide easy reassurance. But that same uncompromising approach limits its appeal to players who want horror that ultimately empowers or reassures rather than creating persistent discomfort. The game makes no apologies for these choices. It exists as the extreme evolution of helplessness-focused horror, the place the genre arrives when it fully commits to powerlessness as theme and mechanic simultaneously. Whether that represents horror's fullest potential or a dead end that's gone too far into oppressiveness to remain meaningfully entertaining depends entirely on what you believe horror should achieve and what costs are acceptable in achieving it. That explains how the game relates to its genre contemporaries, but it doesn't explain the specific elements that make its darkness feel deeper than structural comparisons might suggest, the details that create oppression beyond mechanical design. That requires examining the game's aesthetic and atmospheric choices. Chapter 8: The Aesthetic of Institutional Horror. The visual design of the Outlast Trials communicates institutional evil through carefully calibrated aesthetic choices that distinguish it from horror games relying on obviously grotesque or supernatural imagery. The facility rarely looks overtly nightmarish. Much of it resembles actual institutional spaces: police stations, orphanages, medical facilities, rendered with enough realism that they'd feel mundane if not for the subtle wrongness threaded through every element. This mundane horror creates deeper discomfort than obvious monstrosity. The police station in Kill the Snitch looks like an actual precinct from the 1950s. Booking desks, holding cells, institutional green paint. The architecture matches real civic buildings from that era, but fluorescent lights flicker in patterns that suggest malfunction or deliberate manipulation. Bloodstains appear in locations that institutional cleaning should have addressed. Equipment sits in corners, suggesting uses beyond standard police work. The environment creates dread through implication rather than spectacle. You recognize these spaces as places that should be safe, that exist in the real world to provide order and protection. Seeing them corrupted into torture facilities hits differently than encountering obviously fantastical hell dimensions. The facility is making horror from spaces you might have actually encountered, suggesting that the distance between normal institutions and nightmares might be smaller than you'd prefer to believe. The orphanage demonstrates this through even more disturbing inversions. Children's drawings cover walls, but the content shifts from innocent scribbles to imagery suggesting trauma and abuse. Toys and educational materials fill shelves, but arranged in ways that suggest they're props in a performance rather than objects genuinely meant for children. The mannequin children themselves hit the uncanny valley perfectly, clearly not human but positioned and lit to create constant uncertainty about whether they might be real kids who've been paralyzed or preserved through some terrible process. This aesthetic works because it doesn't explain itself. The game never tells you definitively whether the mannequins are purely decorative or whether something worse is happening. It leaves that uncertainty unresolved, letting your imagination fill gaps with possibilities more specifically horrifying than any confirmed answer could be. The Prime Assets character designs follow similar principles. They look human, recognizably so, which makes their behavior more disturbing than overtly monstrous appearances would create. Coyle wears a police uniform that looks authentic to the era. His baton could be actual equipment from real law enforcement of that period, minus the electricity perhaps. He moves with human physicality, no supernatural speed or strength. Just a man who's very good at hurting people, and has been given permission to do it without limit. Mother Gooseberry wears clothing that suggests institutional caregiving, reinforcing her delusion about protecting children. Her appearance shifts between maternal warmth and manic violence, but these shifts happen through expression and body language rather than physical transformation. She remains human throughout, which makes her fractured personality more unsettling than if she'd been some obviously supernatural entity. Franco Barbie's design emphasizes his physical deformities from Pfeiffer syndrome, making him visibly different but still fundamentally human. The game uses his appearance not to suggest he's monstrous by nature, but to show how physical difference combined with childhood trauma and institutional permission created someone who kills with mechanical efficiency. His cherubic face creates cognitive dissonance with his actions, but the dissonance works because both elements are human rather than fantastical. The facility's color palette contributes to the oppressive atmosphere through washed-out institutional colors. Greens and grays and browns dominate, colors associated with government buildings and institutional spaces from mid-century America. These aren't naturally occurring colors. They're bureaucratic choices, colors selected because they're cheap and functional and require minimal maintenance. Seeing them throughout Signala reinforces that this is a facility designed according to institutional logic, where aesthetics serve efficiency rather than human comfort. Blood and violence appear in this environment as disruptions rather than primary visual elements. The game doesn't drown you in gore. Instead, violence appears as evidence that something terrible happened in spaces designed to look normal. A blood trail leading to a door, scratches on walls suggesting desperate attempts to escape, equipment stained from recent use. These details hit harder than constant gore would because they appear in contexts that make them feel like violations of how these spaces should function. The lighting creates constant unease through inconsistency. Some areas are brightly lit, letting you see everything clearly but removing hiding places and making you feel exposed. Other areas are dimly lit or completely dark, requiring the night vision goggles bolted to your skull to navigate effectively. The transitions between these lighting states happen unpredictably, creating disorientation where you are never sure whether the environment will help or hinder you at any given moment. This inconsistency serves mechanical and atmospheric purposes simultaneously. Mechanically, varied lighting creates different challenges depending on the area. Atmospherically, it reinforces that you don't control anything about this environment. The facility determines visibility. The facility decides whether you can see threats or whether they can see you more easily. Even something as basic as lighting exists as another tool for controlling how you experience trials. The sound design builds on these visual foundations through audio that's simultaneously too quiet and too loud. Ambient sound exists at levels that force you to strain to hear details. Footsteps, breathing, distant machinery. You have to focus to catch these sounds, which means you're constantly listening actively rather than passively experiencing audio. This creates mental fatigue because you can never relax into the soundscape. You have to work to process audio information, and that work never stops. Then specific sounds appear at volumes that feel deliberately excessive. Doors slamming, machinery activating, Easterman's broadcasts suddenly blaring through speakers. The volume spikes feel designed to startle and disorient, to punish your attention and make you flinch. This creates a soundscape where you're either straining to hear or being assaulted by sounds too loud for comfort, with no middle ground where audio feels balanced and predictable. The musical score remains sparse and unsettling rather than traditionally frightening. The game uses drones and atonal sounds that create unease without being obviously scary. These sounds occupy spaces below conscious attention, registering as wrongness before you identify them as music. The score doesn't tell you when to be scared, it just makes everything feel slightly incorrect, slightly unstable, slightly more threatening than visual information alone would suggest. This aesthetic restraint makes the game's darkness feel more realistic and therefore more threatening. Horror games that constantly assault you with grotesque imagery and shocking sounds create intensity that can become numbing through repetition. The Outlast Trials maintains oppression through subtlety, through wrongness that accumulates gradually, rather than hitting you all at once. The facility feels like a place that could exist. The procedures seem like things institutions might actually do if they believed the ends justified the means, and if they had enough power to prevent accountability. This realism makes the horror harder to dismiss as safely fictional. The game suggests that the distance between Signala and real institutions might be thinner than we'd like to believe, that the aesthetics of normal civic buildings and familiar procedures might hide terrible things that only become visible when you're already too entangled to escape. That aesthetic coherence extends to how the game presents its historical connections. Documents scattered throughout the facility reference real events, real programs, real people involved in MKUltra and related projects. These references aren't just Easter eggs. They're evidence that the game's fiction builds on documented fact, that the horror you're experiencing has roots in things that actually happen to real people. This grounding creates darkness that extends beyond the game into reality. When you finish playing, the knowledge that similar procedures were really used doesn't disappear. The facility might be fictional, but the techniques aren't. The horror might be exaggerated for gameplay purposes, but the foundation is historically accurate. That connection makes it harder to compartmentalize the game as pure entertainment safely separated from reality. The aesthetic choices work together to create an experience that feels oppressive without being obviously fantastical, that creates dread through suggestion rather than spectacle, that makes institutional spaces feel threatening through subtle corruption rather than overt transformation. This positions the Outlast Trials as horror that respects audiences enough to trust them with restraint, that understands sometimes the most effective terror comes from what's implied rather than what's shown. But aesthetics and mechanics alone don't fully explain the game's psychological impact. That requires understanding how all these elements combine to create specific emotional experiences that persist beyond individual gameplay sessions. How the game constructs trauma that outlasts the time you spend actively playing it. Chapter 9. Trauma as Gameplay and Psychological Persistence. Most games end when you stop playing. You close the application, step away from the screen, and the experience remains contained within the time you spent actively engaging with it. The emotions might linger briefly, residual adrenaline or satisfaction or frustration, but they dissipate quickly. The game stays in the game. The Outlast Trials creates psychological experiences that persist differently. The game builds trauma through mechanics designed to create associations that don't immediately resolve when gameplay ends. These associations become embedded in how you think about institutional power, complicity, and helplessness in ways that can surface unexpectedly during encounters with real-world systems. This happens through several interconnected mechanisms that work together to create psychological weight beyond what typical gameplay generates. The first mechanism involves forced participation in scenarios that violate personal moral boundaries. When you physically push a screaming snitch into the execution chamber while they beg for mercy, you're performing an action you would likely condemn in any other context. The game provides justification through mechanical necessity. You must complete this objective to progress. Refusing carries consequences that make the trial unwinnable. The structure coerces compliance while maintaining the technical fiction that you chose this action. This creates cognitive dissonance that persists after the session ends. You know intellectually that the choice was forced by game design, but your brain also processed the experience of making that choice, of weighing options, of deciding that completing the objective mattered more than refusing on principle. The emotional memory of that decision remains even after the rational explanation is fully understood. This mirrors how real coercive systems create lasting damage. People forced to compromise their values under institutional pressure carry guilt that rational understanding doesn't fully resolve. Knowing you were coerced doesn't erase the memory of having done the thing you were coerced into doing. The action and the justification exist simultaneously, creating internal conflict that can persist for years after the coercive situation ends. The game replicates this dynamic through repeated trials that force similar choices. Each individual instance might feel manageable, justifiable given the context, but the accumulation creates weight that builds over time. By your 10th trial involving moral compromise, the justifications start feeling thinner. You're not just a player engaging with mechanics anymore. You're someone who's repeatedly chosen to perform terrible actions because the alternative was mechanically inconvenient. This gradual erosion creates changes in how you approach subsequent trials. Early sessions might involve genuine moral wrestling with objectives. You might feel conflicted about participating in executions or rituals, but as you continue playing, that conflict often diminishes. The objectives become routine. You stop thinking about the ethical dimensions and start optimizing for completion speed. This progression demonstrates exactly what the game is critiquing. The trials are designed to normalize atrocity through repetition, to make terrible things feel like ordinary procedures you complete efficiently, rather than moral catastrophes you should resist. When you find yourself mechanically optimizing these scenarios, you've internalized exactly the logic institutional evil requires to function. The second mechanism involves association formation between specific stimuli and stress responses. The game pairs certain sounds, visual cues, and environmental features with immediate danger so consistently that your brain develops automatic responses. Hearing Coyle's electric baton creates tension before you see him. Gooseberry's voice triggers alertness before she appears. Specific musical cues signal that prime assets have detected you. These associations form through classical conditioning that operates below conscious control. Your body responds to the stimuli before your mind processes what's happening. Heart rate increases, muscles tense, attention narrows. These are survival responses, appropriate within the game's context, but they don't immediately disappear when you stop playing. For some players, these conditioned responses can generalize to real-world stimuli that share characteristics with in-game triggers. Institutional spaces might feel more threatening. Certain sounds might create anxiety spikes. Situations involving forced compliance might trigger stronger resistance or helplessness than they did before the game created associations between coercion and trauma. This represents a form of gameplay-induced trauma response that most entertainment doesn't create, because most entertainment doesn't sustain threatening scenarios long enough for deep conditioning to occur. The Outlast Trials can be played for dozens or hundreds of hours, with each session reinforcing the same stimulus response patterns until they become deeply embedded. The third mechanism involves undermining trust in your own perceptions. The game constantly presents situations where your initial interpretation proves incorrect, or where reality shifts in ways that make you question what you witnessed. Was that sound a prime asset or ambient noise? Is Easterman's concern genuine or manipulation? The whole project is essentially gaslighting you the entire time. The facility is designed to create this uncertainty. Environments that should feel stable instead feel unstable. Information that should be reliable instead proves unreliable. You learn through repeated experience that you can't fully trust your perceptions, that the facility deliberately creates confusion, that certainty is impossible in spaces designed to prevent it. This creates a specific form of psychological damage. When you can't trust your perceptions, decision-making becomes exponentially harder. Every choice requires double-checking information that might be false. Every interpretation might be wrong. The mental energy required to navigate this uncertainty accumulates until making even simple decisions feels exhausting. For players who already struggle with anxiety or trust issues, the game can intensify these vulnerabilities. The experience of having your perceptions constantly undermined within the game can bleed into how you process real situations. You might find yourself second-guessing interpretations more frequently, doubting your judgment in contexts that previously felt straightforward, questioning whether your emotional responses to situations are accurate or whether you're being manipulated in ways you can't detect. The fourth mechanism involves identification with victims and perpetrators simultaneously. You're a reagent, a victim of the facility's systems, but you're also complicit in harming other reagents, making you functionally a perpetrator within the same systems victimizing you. This dual position creates psychological complexity that simple victim or perpetrator narratives don't generate. You experience what it feels like to be systematically dehumanized, but you also experience what it feels like to participate in dehumanizing others when institutional structures make that participation feel necessary. This creates empathy for both positions simultaneously, understanding viscerally how people become complicit in systems that also harm them. This dual awareness can change how you think about institutional evil in reality. You might find yourself more willing to understand how ordinary people become complicit in terrible systems, recognizing that complicity doesn't require evil intent, just circumstances that make resistance costly and compliance rewarding. But you might also become more critical of justifications people offer for institutional participation, recognizing those justifications as similar to the ones you used while playing, explanations that made atrocity feel necessary at the time, but feel insufficient when examined afterward. These mechanisms work together to create experiences that don't fully resolve when gameplay ends. The associations remain. The erosion of moral certainty persists. The understanding of how coercive systems function stays with you. For some players, this creates lasting psychological impact that goes beyond typical entertainment. Whether this impact is harmful or beneficial remains contested. Some players report that the game helped them process trauma from real institutional abuse, providing validation and a safe space to confront feelings they couldn't otherwise access. Others report that the game intensified existing anxieties or created new associations between institutional spaces and threat that made real-world navigation more difficult. The game itself doesn't provide guidance about who should engage with it or what psychological preparation might be necessary. It exists as an experience available to anyone who purchases it, regardless of whether they're psychologically equipped to process what it creates. This positions it in ethically ambiguous territory where the same content that provides catharsis for some creates genuine harm for others. That ambiguity might be unavoidable for horror this dark. Experiences intense enough to meaningfully represent institutional trauma will necessarily create responses that vary dramatically based on individual psychological history. What helps one person process might trigger another's breakdown. The game can't predict or control these outcomes because they depend on variables the game can't access. What we're left with is horror that takes genuine psychological risks, that creates experiences potent enough to persist beyond gameplay, that doesn't apologize for that potency or attempt to soften it through reassurance or comic relief. Whether that represents horror at its most powerful or horror that's crossed into irresponsible territory depends entirely on who's experiencing it and what they bring to that experience. But here's what makes this conversation more complicated than simple harm versus benefit calculations. The game's darkness doesn't exist in isolation. It's part of a broader cultural moment where extremely dark horror content has found substantial audiences across multiple media. The Outlast Trials isn't an outlier. It's part of a trend toward horror that refuses to compromise its vision for accessibility. Understanding why this trend exists requires examining what's changed culturally that makes audiences hungry for horror. This unrelenting, wide darkness that previous generations might have rejected as too oppressive now finds dedicated fans who specifically seek out content this intense. That shift reveals something about contemporary psychology and what we're trying to process through fictional horror. Chapter 10. The Cultural Appetite for Unrelenting Darkness. 20 years ago, the Outlast Trials would have struggled to find an audience. Horror gaming in the early 2000s emphasized action horror hybrids where players had significant combat capability. Even survival horror titles provided weapons and agency. The idea of a game built entirely around helplessness, while forcing moral compromise through dozens of hours of gameplay, would have seemed uncommercial, too niche for anything beyond cult appreciation. But something shifted in gaming culture and broader media consumption. Audiences increasingly sought out content that didn't soften its darkness, that committed fully to oppressive atmospheres, and refused to provide easy reassurance. The Outlast Trials emerged into this cultural moment and found substantial commercial success, indicating that appetite for extreme darkness has grown significantly. This shift reflects several converging cultural factors that created conditions where horror this dark could find mainstream rather than purely niche audiences. The first factor involves information saturation about real atrocities. Previous generations learned about institutional evil through curated sources that filtered the worst details. Genocides and torture programs and systematic abuse existed, but average people encountered them through news coverage that maintained professional distance and avoided the most disturbing specifics. The internet destroyed that filtering. Detailed information about historical and contemporary atrocities became accessible to anyone with search capability. People could research MKUltra and read actual documents describing what was done to unwitting subjects. They could find testimonies from torture survivors describing exactly what institutional abuse feels like. They could access information that previous generations never encountered unless they specifically sought it through academic or investigative channels. This accessibility created populations who understand institutional evil in more visceral detail than previous generations typically possessed. When the Outlast Trials represent systematic dehumanization, audiences don't encounter it as fantasy. They recognize it as representation of documented reality they've already learned about through their own research. The game's darkness feels appropriate rather than excessive because it matches what players already know happens in real facilities. Closely related is the declining trust in institutions. Younger generations came of age watching systems fail repeatedly and visibly. Financial systems collapsed in ways that destroyed individual lives while protecting corporate interests. Police violence became documented through ubiquitous cameras, making patterns of abuse undeniable. Governments justified wars through lies that became obvious years before. Official admissions. Churches protected abusers systematically while claiming moral authority. This erosion of institutional trust created populations predisposed to believe that systems claiming to protect people might actually harm them, that authority figures claiming benevolent intent might be lying, that official narratives might conceal terrible realities. When the Outlast Trials presents Murkoff as a corporation hiding torture behind research credentials, audiences don't need to suspend disbelief. That scenario feels plausible based on their understanding of how real institutions operate. A third driver is the normalization of trauma discourse. Mental health discussions have become more open, with larger percentages of populations acknowledging anxiety, depression, and various trauma responses. This created audiences who understand psychological damage not as rare exceptional condition, but as common experience that many people navigate daily. For these audiences, horror, exploring trauma processing doesn't feel like visiting alien emotional territory. It feels like engaging with experiences they already live with, rendered through fictional frameworks that make them more manageable. The Outlast Trials' focus on systematic psychological destruction resonates because trauma survivors recognize the dynamics, see their experiences reflected in mechanics, find validation in representation that doesn't minimize or sanitize what institutional abuse actually does to people. This trend is enabled by entertainment fragmentation. Media consumption has become increasingly individualized, with streaming and digital distribution allowing people to find exactly the content they want rather than consuming whatever broadcast television or mainstream cinema provides. This created space for extreme content that wouldn't have been commercially viable when distribution required mass appeal. The Outlast Trials doesn't need to appeal to general audiences. It needs to find the specific audience that wants horror this dark and uncompromising. Digital distribution makes that commercially feasible in ways that wouldn't have worked when physical retail required products to appeal broadly enough to justify shelf space. The fifth factor involves desensitization requiring escalation. Audiences exposed to constant horror content develop tolerance that makes previously frightening material feel tame. Jump scares that worked effectively decades ago now feel predictable. Gore that would have been shocking becomes routine. This creates pressure for horror to escalate, to find new ways to disturb audiences who've developed immunity to conventional techniques. The Outlast Trials responds to this pressure by going deeper into psychological territory rather than simply increasing violence. The game understands that graphic content alone won't disturb desensitized audiences. What still works is systematic psychological pressure, moral compromise, helplessness sustained over extended periods. These create discomfort that tolerance doesn't eliminate because they target psychological vulnerabilities rather than just shocking senses. The sixth factor involves parasocial relationships with horror content. Streaming culture created audiences who engage with horror socially, watching others play while commenting and discussing. This transformed horror from individual experience to communal event. Games like the Outlast Trials become more bearable and more engaging when experienced collectively, with communities sharing strategies and reactions and interpretations. This social framing makes darker content more accessible. You're not just subjecting yourself to oppressive horror alone, you're participating in shared cultural experience. becoming part of communities built around surviving and discussing particularly intense games. The darkness becomes badge of membership, evidence that you can handle content others might find too much. These factors combine to create cultural conditions where the Outlast Trials' extreme darkness became commercial asset rather than liability. The game found audiences who specifically wanted horror that didn't compromise, who were tired of games that pulled punches or provided reassurance, who sought experiences that matched their understanding of how dark reality actually gets. But this raises the question that's been lurking throughout this analysis. We've examined why the game is dark, how it creates that darkness, who's drawn to it and why, but we haven't directly addressed whether darkness this concentrated serves any purpose beyond creating intense experiences, whether there's meaning in the oppression, or whether it's just cruelty refined into entertainment. That question doesn't have simple answers. Different players will reach different conclusions based on what they brought to the game and what they took from it. But examining what the Outlast Trials reveals about institutional power and human vulnerability might provide some framework for understanding what the darkness accomplishes beyond mere intensity. Chapter 11: What the Darkness Reveals. The Outlast Trials could have been a straightforward horror game about surviving in a dangerous facility. It could have kept the same mechanics and setting but removed the forced moral compromise, the historical grounding, the systematic representation of institutional evil. That version would have been commercially safer, more accessible, less likely to create genuine psychological discomfort. The developers chose differently. They built a game that commits fully to representing how institutional systems destroy people, that forces players to experience both victimization and complicity, that refuses to provide reassurance or suggest that individual heroism can defeat systematic evil. These choices create darkness that serves specific purposes beyond shock value. The first purpose involves demonstrating how coercive systems operate. Most people understand intellectually that institutions can be corrupt, that power corrupts, that systematic abuse happens, but understanding intellectually differs from experiencing viscerally. The Outlast Trials creates experiential knowledge about how coercion functions that pure explanation can't provide. When you're forced to choose between completing a terrible objective or failing the trial, you experience what impossible choices feel like from inside. When you're conditioned through repeated exposure to normalize atrocity, you experience how that normalization happens gradually rather than suddenly. When you're subjected to Easterman's broadcasts while drugged and exhausted, you experience how manipulation works when deployed against psychological vulnerabilities. This experiential knowledge creates understanding that resists the common tendency to blame victims for not escaping coercive situations. Players who've experienced how the trials remove meaningful alternatives develop empathy for people trapped in real coercive systems. The mechanical experience of having your agency systematically eliminated, while technically maintaining choice, demonstrates why just leave isn't meaningful advice when systems are designed to make leaving impossible. The second purpose involves revealing how ordinary people become complicit in institutional evil. The game doesn't position you as someone exceptional or uniquely vulnerable. You're just a person who was in the wrong place at the wrong time, who got processed through systems designed to break anyone subjected to them. Your complicity in harming other reagents doesn't come from personal evil. It comes from institutional structures that make complicity the path of least suffering. This creates uncomfortable recognition that complicity doesn't require malice or moral failure. Most people become complicit in harmful systems through simple calculations about cost and benefit, about what they're willing to endure to maintain resistance, about whether fighting systems is worth the personal consequences. The game demonstrates these calculations through mechanics, showing how quickly principled resistance erodes, when every act of resistance carries immediate painful consequences, while compliance offers relief. This revelation extends beyond the game into how players might think about their own institutional participation. Do you work for organizations whose practices you question? Do you comply with systems you believe cause harm? Do you participate in structures that benefit you while harming others? The game creates framework for examining these questions with less judgment and more understanding about how normal people end up complicit in things they'd condemn from safe distance. The third purpose involves exploring what happens when power removes accountability. The prime assets aren't constrained by law, ethics, or social pressure. They've been given complete authority over reagents and assured that nothing they do will face consequences. The game asks what humans become when these constraints are removed, and the answer is consistently terrible. This serves as warning about institutional power. When organizations operate beyond accountability, when authority figures face no consequences for abuse, when systems protect perpetrators rather than victims, the results are predictable and uniformly harmful. The game doesn't present this as hypothetical. It builds on historical examples where exactly these conditions existed and produced exactly these outcomes. The warning extends to contemporary institutions. What systems currently operate beyond meaningful accountability? What authority figures face no real consequences for abuse of power? What organizations protect their interests over individual well-being? The game creates framework for asking these questions more urgently, for recognizing that Signala isn't distant fiction but pattern that recurs whenever conditions allow. The fourth purpose involves validating trauma survivors' experiences. People who've survived institutional abuse often struggle to convey what that experience felt like to people who haven't lived through it. The specific ways coercive systems destroy agency, the impossibility of the choices presented, the erosion of self through systematic psychological pressure, these dynamics are difficult to explain through language alone. The Outlast Trials represents these experiences through mechanics that create similar emotional responses in players. When trauma survivors see others playing the game and reacting with distress to forced complicity or systematic helplessness, they see their experiences validated. When players who haven't experienced institutional trauma struggle with the game's mechanics and recognize how difficult escape would be, trauma survivors feel seen in ways that pure description rarely achieves. This validation matters because institutional abuse. Survivors often face dismissal or minimization. They're asked why they didn't just leave, why they complied with harmful demands, why they didn't resist more effectively. The game demonstrates answers to these questions through mechanical experience, creating shared understanding that makes survivors' accounts more believable and comprehensible to people who previously struggled to imagine how such situations could trap competent adults. The fifth purpose involves creating space to process difficult emotions that daily life doesn't accommodate. Modern society expects emotional regulation, professional demeanor, maintenance of social harmony. This creates pressure to suppress feelings about powerlessness, rage at injustice, fear of institutional power. These emotions don't disappear when suppressed. They accumulate, creating psychological pressure without outlet. The Outlast Trials provides controlled space to experience these emotions intensely. You can feel helpless against systematic oppression without real consequences. You can rage against institutional cruelty without professional or social costs. You can confront fears about losing agency without actually losing it permanently. The game becomes container for emotional experiences that normal life prohibits, allowing cathartic release of pressures that otherwise remain unaddressed. These purposes collectively suggest the darkness serves functions beyond creating intense entertainment. The game uses horror to explore themes that lighter approaches couldn't address effectively, to create understanding through experience rather than explanation. to validate realities that often face dismissal or incomprehension. But recognizing these purposes doesn't resolve whether they justify the darkness or whether the same insights could be achieved through less potentially harmful approaches. That question remains open, contested, ultimately dependent on individual assessment about where horror's responsibilities lie and what costs are acceptable in pursuit of meaningful art. What seems clear is that the Outlast Trials represents horror that takes itself seriously as medium for exploring difficult realities, that believes games can do more than merely entertain, that's willing to create genuine discomfort in service of themes it considers important. Whether that willingness represents horror at its most powerful, or horror that's lost sight of entertainment's primary obligations, depends entirely on what you believe games should be allowed to do, and what they should refuse to do, regardless of thematic justification. This brings us to the final question we need to address. We've examined what makes the game dark, how it compares to other horror, why audiences seek it out, what it reveals about institutional power. But we haven't confronted the most uncomfortable aspect of all, what it means that we consume institutional horror as entertainment, what our engagement with this content says about us, and the culture that produced both the game and its audience. Chapter 12. The Ethics of Consuming Institutional Horror. There's a fundamental tension in playing the Outlast Trials that the game never resolves, and perhaps can't resolve. The systematic abuse the game represents is based on real suffering inflicted on real people. MKUltra actually destroyed lives. Institutional torture continues in various forms across the globe. The psychological techniques the game simulates were developed through experiments that left victims permanently damaged. When we play a game built on this foundation, what are we actually doing? Are we processing trauma, building empathy, creating understanding about institutional evil? Or are we consuming others' suffering as entertainment, creating comfortable distance from realities that should provoke action rather than gameplay? This question becomes more urgent because the game is designed to be played repeatedly. You're meant to run trials multiple times to optimize your strategies, to improve your performance. This transforms systematic abuse from something you witness once into content you engage with for entertainment value over extended periods. The repetition that makes you better at the game is the same repetition that normalizes the atrocity the game represents. Some argue this normalization serves the game's themes. The entire point is demonstrating how repeated exposure makes terrible things feel routine, how institutional evil functions through gradual normalization rather than sudden transformation. By making you complicit in that normalization through gameplay, the game creates experiential understanding that commentary alone couldn't achieve. Others argue that regardless of thematic intent, the practical result is people treating institutional torture as entertainment content to be consumed, optimized, and discussed in terms of mechanical efficiency rather than moral horror. The fact that the game critiques this dynamic doesn't prevent it from also participating in it, creating the same problematic relationship to suffering it claims to examine. This tension extends to the game's commercial success. The Outlast Trials is a product sold for profit. Red Barrels, the development studio, benefits financially from creating content that represents institutional torture. Players purchase access to experiences built on systematic abuse. The entire transaction exists within capitalist frameworks where suffering, even fictional suffering based on real atrocities, becomes commodity to be bought and sold. Does this commodification undermine whatever critical or therapeutic purposes the darkness might serve? Can horror that profits from representing institutional evil meaningfully critique that evil? Or does the profit motive inherently compromise the critique? These questions don't have comfortable answers because they implicate everyone involved in creating and consuming the content. The game's relationship to real trauma survivors adds another ethical dimension. For some survivors, the game provides validation and cathartic space to process experiences that don't have other outlets. But for others, the game's content might trigger genuine trauma responses, creating psychological harm that entertainment shouldn't inflict, regardless of artistic intent. The game provides no content warnings beyond basic genre designation. It doesn't assess whether players are psychologically equipped to handle its content, or provide resources for players who might experience trauma responses. It simply exists as product available to anyone who purchases it, trusting players to self-select appropriately, despite many players lacking clear understanding of what the game actually contains before experiencing it. This raises questions about responsibility. Do developers creating content this potentially harmful have obligations to assess risk and provide support? Or is player responsibility sufficient with the expectation that adults can make informed decisions about their media consumption and seek help if needed? Different ethical frameworks reach different conclusions, with no clear consensus about where responsibility lies. The multiplayer dimension complicates this further. When you play with others, you're creating their experience as much as your own. If you optimize trials through strategies that make the content more mechanically focused and less emotionally present, you might be helping teammates avoid trauma responses, but you might also be facilitating the normalization the game critiques, helping others distance themselves from the horror's implications. If you instead play in ways that maintain emotional engagement with what the trials represent, you might be preserving the game's critical purpose, but you might also be intensifying others' exposure to content they're trying to manage by maintaining mechanical distance. There's no clear right approach, because players bring different needs and vulnerabilities that remain invisible to teammates. The community that forms around the game adds yet another dimension. Fan content includes gameplay guides, lore analysis, character discussions, and creative works building on the game's foundation. This community engagement can provide spaces for processing the game's themes collectively, creating meaning through shared interpretation that individual play might not achieve. But community engagement can also create pressure to demonstrate that you can handle the content without difficulty, to prove you're not too sensitive or too affected. This pressure might lead people to minimize their actual responses, to continue engaging with content that's harmful to them because admitting difficulty feels like failure. The community becomes simultaneously support structure and source of additional pressure, helpful and harmful in ways that vary between individuals. These ethical complexities don't resolve into clear guidance about whether games like the Outlast Trials should exist or whether playing them is morally acceptable. They exist in genuinely ambiguous territory, where the same content serves beneficial and harmful purposes depending on who's engaging with it and how. What we can say with more certainty is that engaging with horror, this dark requires more thoughtfulness than typical entertainment consumption. You can't approach the Outlast Trials the way you'd approach a casual game and expect neutral results. The content creates psychological effects that persist beyond gameplay, and those effects can be beneficial or harmful, depending on individual circumstances the game can't predict or control. This suggests that responsibility falls primarily on individuals to assess their own readiness for content this intense, to monitor their responses, to disengage if the experience creates harm rather than insight. But it also suggests that the gaming community and developers might have obligations to provide clearer information about what the content actually involves and what psychological risks it might create. The broader cultural question remains open. What does it mean that we've reached a point where institutional torture becomes entertainment content with substantial commercial success? Does this represent society processing collective trauma about institutional power? Does it represent desensitization that's gone too far, creating distance from suffering that should provoke engagement rather than entertainment? Does it represent horror maturing into form capable of addressing difficult realities? Does it represent exploitation of serious themes for profit? These questions don't have single answers because they depend on perspectives, values, and beliefs about what art should be allowed to do. The Outlast Trials exists in the space where these questions converge, creating an experience that forces anyone engaging with it to confront their own answers rather than relying on cultural consensus that doesn't exist. The game refuses to resolve these tensions or provide reassurance that your engagement serves purely beneficial purposes. It exists as deliberately uncomfortable object that creates discomfort about institutional power and about your own consumption of content representing that power. Whether that dual discomfort represents horror at its most sophisticated or horror that's become too ethically compromised to justify depends entirely on individual judgment. What remains undeniable is that the Outlast Trials represents horror willing to take genuine risks, to create content that might alienate audiences, to refuse compromise even when compromise would be commercially safer. That willingness has created something genuinely challenging in medium that often defaults to safety, something that forces difficult questions rather than providing comfortable answers. Whether those questions and that challenge justify the darkness or whether the game ultimately goes too far into territory horror shouldn't occupy, that's a question each player must answer for themselves. And the answer will vary based on what they believe entertainment should provide, and what lines it shouldn't cross, regardless of thematic ambition. Outro. The Outlast Trials is dark because it refuses to look away from institutional evil's actual mechanics. It shows how coercive systems destroy people, how ordinary individuals become complicit, how power without accountability produces predictable atrocity. It grounds this horror in historical reality that makes it impossible to dismiss as safely fictional, and it creates experiences that persist beyond gameplay, changing how players think about institutional power and human vulnerability. The game found its audience because cultural conditions created populations hungry for horror that doesn't compromise, that matches their understanding of how dark reality actually gets, that provides space to process difficult emotions and experiences that daily life doesn't accommodate. It succeeds where other horror games approach similar themes because it commits fully to its premise without pulling punches or providing easy reassurance. Whether this darkness serves valuable purposes or goes too far into potentially harmful territory remains contested and perhaps ultimately individual. The game creates different experiences for different players based on what psychological vulnerabilities and needs they bring to it. What helps one person process trauma might trigger another's breakdown. What creates meaningful insight for some might create problematic distance from real suffering for others. What we can say with certainty is that the Outlast Trials represents horror that takes itself seriously, that believes games can meaningfully explore difficult realities, that's willing to create genuine discomfort in service of themes it considers important. The darkness isn't accidental or gratuitous. It's integral to what the game is trying to achieve, and that achievement is genuinely challenging in ways most horror games never attempt. The game exists now, available to anyone curious enough or brave enough or damaged enough to want horror this relentless. It will continue finding audiences who need exactly what it provides, while repelling others for whom the darkness crosses lines they're not willing to approach. And it will remain an ambiguous object that forces difficult questions rather than providing comfortable answers. Art that refuses to tell you whether engaging with it makes you better or worse, wiser or more damaged. That ambiguity might be the most honest thing about it.